of sales, except for the history you do not know. Welcome to the Sales History Podcast, bringing the brilliant and sometimes strange minds, methods, and ideas from the sales profession's past with applications to today. Here is your host, best-selling author of The Transparency Sale and The Transparent Sales Leader, keynote speaker, trainer, and nerd, Todd Caponi.
Death of a Salesman. Now, I'm not talking about the play written by Arthur Miller back in 1949. I'm talking about the profession itself, the sales profession. Today's episode is a bit of a rant, and it's based on another one of these posts you see claiming the, quote, death of something significant as it relates to the sales profession. It's not a new thing or even an infrequent thing that we see posts or hear comments about how the demise of the sales profession is near or about the death of some element of it. Those death of posts are always followed by responses to both justify the practice and preach its long-term survivability. I mean, just Google search any of these phrases. Cold calling is dead. Email is dead. Outbound as we know it is dead. The SDR, sales development role, is dead. As it turns out, none of these claims age very well, do they? So let's go back to one of those times when the death of sales was here. All right, so let's look at 1907. I was reading about this concern about the rise of advertising, and that there were quotes like these. Quote, "The advertising craze practically puts a salesperson out of business." Quote, "Too much advertising makes a mere sideshow of personal sales." And then yet another quote, "A large number of concerns who still employ salespeople have practically eliminated salespeople from their business-getting plan in favor of advertising." So that was 1907. Fast forward 5 years to 1912. Once again, another death was near. Thomas Herbert Russell was talking about and proclaimed that, quote, "Buyers know more nowadays." We hear those four words all the time today, but he was adding the rise of mail order catalogs to the list of sales profession killers. As a matter of fact, in my collection here, as you know, I'm almost creating a sales museum here in my home. My wife is a saint for putting up with that, but regardless, I have a 1908 Sears Roebuck catalog in my collection, and it's literally like a printed version of today's Amazon. The thought was buyers didn't need salespeople anymore by 1912 because catalogs were so readily available, and what do we need to talk to salespeople for? Let's go to the 1920s when there was yet another death, and this one had to do with the fact that executive buyers didn't want to talk to salespeople anymore. Does that sound familiar? I think it does. They literally started having junior employees ordering business catalogs to their home addresses, and then they would bring them in with them to work. So those executives could do their own homework without salespeople ever bothering them. So that's not a new thing either. Let's fast forward to 1952. The entire profession was talking about a 2-page article, kind of like an advertisement that appeared in many magazines, and it was called The Vanishing American. And in the article, it proclaimed the demise of the direct or door-to-door sales profession. The article had a wreath being laid at the tomb of the door-to-door salesman. It showed a salesperson with one foot in the door and, quote, a housewife holding a vicious dog, trying to keep him out, end quote. Salespeople, quote, even had the door slammed in their faces by law in some 400 localities. In other words, there were actually laws being put into different communities that were meant to prevent salespeople from being able to do door-to-door selling. Now, just like every death of comment from today, the counterpoints always quickly followed. There's a guy named Harry Lemons. It's Lemmons, so not like the lemon, but close. He was the president of a company called Salad Master Sales, Inc., and in 1952, along with that Vanishing American article, he put his counterpoint by saying, "When I read The Vanishing American, I couldn't help but opening the door and looking out over the office, watching our promotion department trying to keep current the processing of new contracts for our direct salesmen. They are making money, big money, more money than they could make working on a salary. That was the end of the quote. But that was another case of another death that I don't think it's aged well. Now, I won't go back further than 1900 here, other than to say that during the Roman Empire, the death of the sales profession was, well, literal. They were being killed. As the merchants from Rome began to leave Rome to do their selling in other regions of Europe, they weren't welcome. And in some countries, they were literally rounded up and killed. But I digress. Sales resistance is as old as the human being, I guess. Even as recently as 2015, Forrester, quote, forecasts 1 million B2B salespeople will lose their jobs to self-service e-commerce by 2020, accounting for 20% of the B2B sales force. Again, that's from Forrester. That's a direct quote. What happened? In every case, the profession adjusted and proved resilient. Actually, the profession actually thrived for those who view the profession as a service profession. Big letter service there, a service profession, the original design of the profession. I go back to Arthur Sheldon, and one of my favorite quotes of all time, it's from his 1911 book, The Art of Selling. And his quote is, "True salesmanship is the science of service." Grasp that thought firmly and never let go. With some rare exceptions, every book I've read on selling from 1903 to 1916 had this lens. Everybody was preaching service. Sheldon's most famous quote, "He profits most who serves best," is still the motto of the Rotary 115, 116 plus years after his joining of the Rotary in 1908. That's amazing. In Detroit, Michigan in 1916, the site of the first ever true sales conference, the World Sales Congress, which was attended by over 3,000 patrons, the theme of that conference was just one word: service. And keep in mind, that conference's keynote was from then sitting President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, as the rest of the world was devolving into World War I. Wilson, again, the 28th President of the United States from 1913 to 1921. Service from salespeople was that important. Here's a paragraph from his speech. It's from July 10th of 1916. Quote, "There is a great deal of cant talked, my fellow citizens, about service. I wish the word had not been surrounded with so much sickly sentimentality, because it is a good, robust, red-blooded word, and it is the key to everything that concerns the peace and prosperity of the world. You cannot force yourself upon anybody who is not obliged to take you. The only way in which you can be sure of being accepted is by being sure that you have got something to offer that is worth taking. And the only way you can be sure of that is by being sure that you wish to adapt it to the use and the service of the people to whom you are trying to sell." End quote. Again, that was Woodrow Wilson, July 10th of 1916, the service mindset. Did we suffer the death of that service mindset? I mean, through all my reading in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and even into the 50s, I've only found one similar quote to Arthur Sheldon's on the science of service. It's from 1929. John G. Jones of the Alexander Hamilton Institute, who said, quote, "True salesmanship is a keen desire to serve, not a deep anxiety to put something over. When a salesman oversells, he defeats his own ends." Why would it have gone away? I mean, wouldn't so many of these death ofs go away if we got it back, the service mindset? Why did it disappear and so quickly? I've been thinking a lot about that, and here's my take. I feel like we have generations of salespeople, meaning a generation comes and then moves on, then another generation. Let's think about it this way. I mean, for the most part, and this is in general kind of an unscientific point, but salespeople sell on the front lines for maybe 10, 15 years, right? Some do it for 30 plus years, some for a shorter period, but I'd argue that we learn to sell early in our careers. We're taught based on the then current hottest way to sell, or basically what worked for our manager. So the sellers from just before us. We carry that with us, adjust and evolve a bit, then maybe get promoted. When promoted, we start teaching what worked when we were selling. That becomes the foundation for those under you, the leader. They learn, they use, and grow up in the profession to teach what worked for them. It doesn't take long for what was old to be, generation out, right? For example, imagine if you were a salesperson in 1910. You learned to sell from a service lens, hopefully. 1918 comes along. Maybe you get drafted into World War I and you're out of the sales game for a while, but for those who didn't and kept selling, you were likely promoted because less salespeople, and just like today, we promote what's left that's still good. However, times were much different then when you sold, right? In 1918, you were selling in a wartime economy, and the economy was then set off on a roller coaster. I mean, in many cases, it was shut down for the war, but as the war ended, there was a boom time where selling was super easy. So selling skills weren't even that hard. It was kind of like working in today's drive-through window, right? Where companies are just coming up throwing money in the window. And then we had a depression in early 1920, and that really lasted 21, 22, 23. We started to see our recovery. I mean, normal times of selling didn't return until 1924. So that's 6+ years where selling skills were most needed during historically difficult selling conditions. What worked in that time was high pressure. I mean, numbers and scale and pressure on buyers. Service was already a thing of past. I mean, that was 1918 versus 1924 already. And so now you've got a period from 1924 to 1928 where high pressure was becoming the in thing. Fast forward to 1929 when people like John G. Jones, I mentioned his service quote, they were potentially trying to raise service as a selling lens again, but what happened in 1929? We started the Great Depression. And that lasted all the way to 1939. And then we come out of the Great Depression. What happened after that? World War II. It wasn't until 1947 or 1948 before a return to normal selling was back. If you started selling in 1910, say even if you were right out of college or somewhere around there, maybe you were 21, 22, sometime like that, you're now 60 years old. The philosophers of service and sales were all gone. Sheldon, Norval Hawkins, Worthington Holman, all those people, Lucinda Prince, so many others. They were retired, and in many cases, most of those people had passed away. So service was generationed out. All of these death of things, the things that should die, are the things that aren't done through the empathetic lens of the buying experience, optimizing for the buying brain. Quote, if men with things to sell mean to serve themselves and the consuming world better and justify their existence, there must be a better understanding of the new kind of salesmanship, end quote. That's from S. Rowland Hall in 1924. There's always a new kind of salesmanship. It's the evolved version of the old kind of salesmanship. I would just suggest you do what creates optimal outcomes for your customers. Ignore the death of stuff, but don't ignore that point, service. I'll just leave it there for today, but when you see things that are so extravagant about is cold calling dead, is outbounding dead, is the SDR role dead, is email dead. I actually just read an article saying that podcasts are dead. Are people listening anymore? I think most of that is complete garbage. The sales profession has always been so resilient. Again, we went all the way back to 1907 when they were claiming the sales profession was dying. And here we are 120 years later or whatever, and we're still thriving, we are still growing. And those people that survive, those people that thrive, those people that grow in this profession do it through the lens of service. Let's get that back. And we will still be talking about these posts and comments 20, 30, 40 years from now as we continue to be in the sales profession and doing it with pride and helping customers to achieve optimal outcomes. I hope you enjoyed this little rant for today. I hope there's pieces that you can use to combat those thoughts of the death of anything having to do with the sales profession. Continue to do it right, and we'll all be sitting here long from now looking back on our careers with pride. So, as always, I appreciate you listening, appreciate you sharing. Remember that you can get daily posts at Sales Historian on both Instagram and on X. Every day I'm sharing a quote, I'm sharing a comic, I'm sharing a clip, a picture from sales history's past. It's my nerdery outlet, just like this podcast is. I don't monetize this at all. I do it for fun. So I appreciate you continuing to provide feedback. And like I said, share it, review it, and if you've got ideas, reach out, because I'd love to continue to research and continue to find more things that you'd be interested in. So, as always, thanks again.